My track record, you probably weren't expecting me to be back so soon, just like I didn't expect this game to cause me this much trouble. Look, writing this review took way more time than it should have, and after going through about 3 different scripts, I realized I was putting way too much effort into a review for a game that maybe 2 of you guys have heard about. I know in my last review I said that Death's Door was the hardest game for me to talk about, but I think I might have jumped the gun on that one. While Death's Door was difficult to critique due to its most standout elements being things I never really paid too much attention to in other games, Strayed Lights on the other hand is difficult for me to properly articulate my feelings on. Not because I don't have strong feelings or opinions on the game, but because my feelings are constantly shifting. On one hand, I want to praise the game due to the excellent combat system, which was clearly the developer's main focus, while on the other hand, I want to criticize the game on almost everything else surrounding that. And I do mean everything else. Strayed Lights is an immersive action-adventure game, which I have a hard time agreeing with because I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be immersed in. I can't say the world because although the game is graphically pretty good, visually it's as plain as a rye sandwich on Wonder Bread. Most of the areas in the game are completely empty aside from a few enemies scattered around and some upgrade materials. And even with that, I don't feel like they help any, because often you can go a full minute or 2 just wandering around before running into anything. Now, I would say this discourages you from exploring if there was anything really for you to explore, as the game tries to trick you into thinking the areas are bigger than they actually are by filling the area with potential paths that lead to fuck all. So truthfully, the game's areas often felt like corridors that were just leading you from one combat encounter to the next, which I would have been fine with if the areas were visually appealing to look at. Most areas in the game look the exact same. I mean like Control-C, Control-V similar. Most of the areas have this dark bluish purple tint look that makes each area feel the exact same, making it a bit hard to differentiate between them. The one time the game decides to turn the damn lights on, the game looked great. The world was vibrant and enjoyable to look at. But unfortunately, the game didn't want to pay extra on the light bill and turn that shit off after like 5 minutes. The only difference between some of the areas in the game is some of the landscapes. But again, there's nothing in these landscapes to actually explore, and traversing through them isn't much better. Now when it comes to traversing the areas in Strayed Lights, there honestly isn't much to talk about since you spend most of your time just walking and running through. But to break up the monotony, the game throws in a bit of light platforming, but oh, don't you worry, because that is pretty shit too. A lot of platforming boils down to holding the analog stick in a single direction as you shimmy across or climb up a ledge, and the ones that actually involve jumping from one platform to the next feels awful to do. Now I don't know how to best articulate how something feels awful, but just bear with me. Unlike most platformers where you the player have to time and gauge the distance for you to make your jump, Strayed Lights decides to go away with this and instead forces you to stand in a particular spot and hit the jump button there for you to make your jump. And if you try to do anything else, you won't make it because your normal jump takes you about 2 centimeters off the ground. This system takes away agency from the player when engaging with the platforming and just makes platforming more of a chore to use rather than an interesting and fun gameplay element. Which finally leads us into combat, which is when the game gets uncharacteristically good. And I mean really fucking good. Strayed Lights combat is centered around an energy meter that you fill up by stealing energy from enemies. Once that bar is filled, you then release the stolen energy which kills them. The main way you accomplish this is through damaging enemies as well as parrying them, although your light and charge attacks deal very minimal energy, making your primary way of energy gain be parrying. Like most parry systems in games, you do it by pressing the block button right before the enemy attack lands. Simple enough. Where Strayed Light innovates on this system is by having the only way to perfect parry these enemies is by matching the color of the attack they're trying to hit you with. So, blue with blue, orange with orange, and purple with fuck you, dodge. Parrying in the right color is not only the primary way for you to steal and gain energy, but it also serves as your only way to heal, while parrying in the incorrect color only negates the damage. This is the rock on which the Church of Strayed Lights combat is built, since again, your normal attacks are pretty shit. To somewhat circumvent this, however, there's a few special abilities that you can get throughout the game. 3 to be exact. One that stuns the enemy, allowing you to get some free hits in, however this suffers from the same issue of your attacks basically just tickling them. The second special ability is a charge attack that slams you into an enemy, stealing a decent amount of energy from them. The third and final ability gives you the ability to parry any attack regardless of what color you or they are in, which kinda takes away from the one special part of the combat, but since some enemies can attack and change colors so sporadically that it's almost impossible to accurately parry them, I've decided to let it slide. This is a pretty good segue into enemies, or I guess the lack thereof. Throughout the game, there's only 4 standard enemies: a spider dude, a gorilla dude, a cyclops guy, and a sword guy. And sword guy doesn't show up until like the final hour and a half of the game. Although the game lacks in quantity of enemies, it definitely makes up for it with the quality of them. Each enemy has a unique moveset that separates them from one another, like the Cyclops Eye Beam and the Gorilla's Rush Attack. Not only that, but later on in the game, the enemies will not only learn new moves, but will delay and change the timing of their attacks to trip up your parry timing or to catch you attacking early. Even with that, I still wish the game had more regular enemies for you to fight, because as you would probably guess, fighting the same 4 enemies for an entire game can not only get repetitive, but become mind-numbingly easy as well. Even with the 2 enemy ganks that the game tries to throw in, which is its own problem in itself. Most fights in the game are one-on-one, which allows the parry system to shine, but when the game decides to make it a 2v1 is when the church starts to crumble. For one, the camera starts to fucking seize up when locked on and trying to bounce between enemies, making it pretty useless in these fights. Then a lot of the times what ends up happening is that the enemy attacks end up being overlapped on top of each other, making it nigh impossible to perfectly parry attacks, since if you get one, you're most likely going to get hit by the other. You might think that to handle that issue, you would just have to use proper spacing, but typically in these fights I found that the enemies would start to spam their purple attacks, requiring you to constantly dodge to avoid them, making it hard to parry or attack the other enemy. But honestly, there aren't that many of these fights, so I wouldn't say that it ruins the combat. Plus, fighting normal mobs isn't where Strayed Light's combat stands tall. It does that through its boss fights. I say stands tall, but what I mean is stands period, as not only is combat built around boss fights, but I could argue the game as a whole. Boss fights are clearly where most of the enemy design time was spent, and it shows. Each boss is not only visually distinct, but each has a unique moveset that best exemplifies the parry system. Not only are their attacks well telegraphed, for the most part, but each switches their color with a decent timing in between, which gives you time to properly match colors with them. Timing is honestly a great word to describe the boss fights, because once you get the boss's attack pattern down, the game almost becomes a rhythm game. Now, yes, you can make an argument that that's for most boss fights in any game, but I would especially say that here, since with the color changing system, going from switching to the correct enemy color, then parrying, feels like you're locked in an intimate dance with the boss. Throw in the occasional dodge, regular attack, and special attack, and you basically got the next Dance Dance Revolution. Not only do the bosses do a great job at highlighting the strengths of the parry system, some of them engage with it in interesting ways. For the sake of not spoiling them, I'm only going to talk about one, but since there's only 2 that I can think of off top, feel free to skip to the time step ahead to avoid any spoilers. Now, back to what I was saying, in the long arm fight, and yes, I named the bosses since the game didn't bother to, instead of the boss directly changing colors, the fog in the arena will slightly change to the color of the boss's attack, causing you to pay attention to both the boss and your surroundings, which is a good way to keep the combat interesting. Difficulty-wise, bosses are also pretty balanced, to the point that if you're thinking on your toes and are decent enough with your parry, you can beat most of them on your first try. The game does a good job at doing this without making the bosses feel like they're a cakewalk, but unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. For some reason, the game doesn't allow you to lock onto the giant fucking bosses, but allows you to do so on the small enemies, making some of the more erratic bosses hard to keep track of. Now, some of you may have noticed that I haven't spoken on the story once, and that was an intentional thing, because this game doesn't really have a story. Okay, I mean, it kinda does, but it kinda doesn't. Just let me explain. Strayed Lights doesn't have a traditional story with cutscenes or story beats or any form of narrative direction. Instead, the game, I think, opts to do environmental storytelling, which is typically a good thing, as showing and not telling is one of the ways gaming typically has an upper hand in, with it being interactive. However, I say I think because the game only really has like 2 points of environmental storytelling, and all that is are some still images. No text, no dialogue, nothing. Just 2 fucking pictures each. Other than that, there are 2 story cutscenes at the beginning of the game and cutscenes to initiate a fight with each boss and one to end it. But these have nothing to do with the story, so I honestly don't know why I brought them up. Now, one could argue that the game wants you to piece the story together yourselves with little clues, and I would argue, yes, you are probably right, but that doesn't mean that they went the right way about doing that. For example, Dark Souls, which at this point is the golden standard for environmental storytelling, gives out enough details through NPC interactions, item descriptions, and cutscenes. This gives you a strong enough foundation to build your own interpretation of things. Strayed Lights, however, gives you none of that, throws a pen at you and tells you to figure that shit out yourself. But luckily for you, that's exactly what I did. So let me give you my interpretation of Strayed Light's story. 1,000 years ago, well, actually there isn't a specific time frame given, but most stories start like that, so let's just roll with it. A group of hooded figures that I'm gonna call the creators for simplicity's sake found a big ass light crystal and used the light from the crystals to create your siblings. After this, they enjoyed a time of peace, but everything changed when the Corruption Nation attacked. To combat this, the creators decided to combine all of their individual light from the crystals to essentially create Light Jesus. You are Light Jesus, and after waking up to the ruins of the Creator Society, become corrupted yourself, and after fighting what is essentially the Light Devil, you have some of your light stolen and corrupted, turning into the enemies that you fight throughout the game. This somewhat explains why the whole shtick of gameplay is stealing energy from enemies, since the energy was yours in the first place. But I feel like this just leaves us with more questions than answers. Now, I know a lot of you are probably wondering where the corruption came from, and I'm right there with you because the game does not do a good job at explaining it. I originally thought it was an evil force that attacks the Creator Society, but while revisiting the game and seeing how the game starts, I don't know if that's true. I already went over how at the beginning of the game you fight the corruption devil, and having your light stolen is what creates the regular enemies that you face. But what I didn't say is that the fight takes place inside of your inner world, which makes me wonder if the creation of Light Jesus is what led to the corruption in the first place. Or could it have been the doing of some of the creators? Or could it just be some random outside force that just happens to attack them? And honestly, the world may never know. Look, I've already put way too much time and thought into talking about a story whose only purpose is to serve as a driver for the player and nothing more. So yeah, I'm done talking about the story, so let's get back to the main thing that any of us really care about, which is the gameplay. Now, I said earlier that this game was built around these boss fights, and I think it's about time for me to explain. As you can tell, I love the boss fights and how they best accentuate the combat system, but unfortunately this level of quality isn't shared with the rest of the game. I already went over how weak the exploration is, and since beating up on the differently able is wrong, I'm not going on it anymore. But I feel like this game really missed an opportunity. Since the game is relying on boss fights to carry it above its poor, well, everything else, why not just make the game a boss-rich game? Now I know it basically already is, because it only takes about maybe 10 minutes to go from the starting area to the boss arena, but why not just take out the middleman and get straight to the dopamine dealer that is the boss fights? Look at a game like Fury, where you can go from one boss fight to another in about 5 minutes, and the time spent in between actually has a significant purpose of relaying story points. Whereas in Straight Lights, that in-between time is basically useless. Okay, that's not entirely true, since fighting the regular enemies does give you back some of your stolen light from a story perspective, and from a gameplay perspective gives you the currency to upgrade yourself with. But I would honestly prefer them just get taken out and add 6 more bosses made with the same quality as the others. But if you wanted to leave it how it is, I would say make those in-between points more engaging from a gameplay perspective. And I know an easy way this could have been done. After beating the first phase of a boss, there's a QTE where you kinda gain the ability that the boss had. So for example, if a boss was very reliant on kicks, your legs would grow in that cutscene, giving you an edge in the fight. Why not let us keep that little power up to help us get to the second phase? Continuing with the leg example, that can increase our normal jump height, give us a double jump or a super jump, or hell, even all of the above, allowing the player to reach higher places. This would add some spice to the otherwise tasteless platforming and give each boss even more uniqueness. And if you're worried about balancing, you could just have it only last until you fully beat the boss. But like I've said before, what do I know? I am not a game developer. Look, I know I've been kinda going hard on this game, almost to a point where some of you probably think I hate it, but surprise surprise, I actually don't. Like I said before, I don't like beating up on the differently abled, and I wouldn't go on for this long on a game that I hated and thought was unsalvageable. In actuality, I like this game and think it has a lot of potential, it just missed the mark on a few things, and for this being Ember Studios' first title, I think they have a pretty good foundation to build off of. The combat system was great, and the bosses they built around it are amazing and complement it perfectly. It's just the things around it that need a bit more work, and I would love to see them build upon this in a sequel. I'm gonna end this video recommending that you pick up this game and try it for yourself. If you enjoy tight and rewarding combat systems, then you definitely owe it to yourself to play it. And since the game is only $25, there isn't too much of a reason for you to not to at least give it a try. And if you don't like it, well, blame them, not me.